Where we're at as a nation on so many fronts, from vaccines to even the climate report out this week. We've got David Gazzard from the DPG Advisories, the director there, and former Liberal.
It could be modelled on what we've seen overseas.
Even the ability to go to, sporting events and.
This needs certainty of what the terms we operate under are.
A publican's plea for a post-pandemic future. Andrea Crothers, Sky News, Canberra.
Let's get some analysis of where we're at as a nation on so many fronts, from vaccines to even the climate report out this week. We've got David Gazzard from the DPG Advisories, the director there, and former Liberal advisor, and Ben Oquist, executive director of the Australia Institute. Ben, first to you. When you look at the lockdowns, no end in sight in Sydney, a better situation in Melbourne, but another lockdown. We really do look to that end game, don't we, of when the vaccine level will be high enough so that we can move beyond this period.
Yeah, firstly on lockdowns, there is a consensus now that lockdowns work and lockdowns were needed. We did have that kind of dispute before, and it's really only kind of a crazy populist right that dismisses the idea of lockdowns. I mean, I've seen people writing in the papers from that section of the debate that some people actually like lockdowns, and some in the community want them. It's just nonsense, of course. But there is an acceptance from the Prime Minister down that lockdowns, hard and fast, is the best solution. That's where Gladys went wrong. I think it's a big change in the debate, that full acceptance of that they're the best health, economic response. I think it's worth acknowledging that. But we do need to get that vaccine rollout done faster. I heard Fruin saying today the key thing is people's willingness to come forward. The supply issues will be worked out, notwithstanding it's been a disaster and we should have had the supply sorted. That will get fixed out. It will be people's willingness. This is the big problem, though, the kind of disinformation and the misinformation that's out there peddled by some people about the vaccines. Now, the first part of the vaccine rollout, in some ways, the easiest because you get people who are willing to take it. It's the last part where that disinformation, and the problem for the government is there plenty on its own side peddling that. And how to tackle that disinformation while allowing free speech is one of our big challenges, and it's not helped when a lot of those people are allies of the government or with the government, and I think that's going to be a political problem for them, how to manage that.
David, do you agree with that?
I just don't think that's borne out by the data. We saw a poll this week that showed that there's a greater hesitancy among Labor voters and particularly Green voters. The Conservative side of politics is willing to embrace the rollout. I do think it is incumbent and important on everyone in the debate. One of the things that really set the program back was shifting advice and different advice that came that said certain vaccines were more dangerous. That has been something I think that has hampered the rollout. But at the moment, each and every day it's accelerating, I think, which is a great sign, and we're hitting our straps in terms of getting to a point. Don't forget too that once you're on for one dose, you're really just in the queue to get the second dose. So it's really a matter of time.
And that momentum is self-fulfilling. And once you get to that sort of 75, 80%, and people who might be wavering, not anti-vaxxers, but just wavering, maybe heard some misinformation and they've got the wrong steer, when they see their family getting it and their friends getting it and everything's fine, they'll probably end up getting it.
This has been part of, if you want to call it Australia's problem. We didn't have the deaths that other countries did who rushed through approvals for vaccines. And there was work done at the beginning, and a vast majority of Australians, up into the 70%, wanted to make sure the vaccines were approved properly and they were safe. That's a very realistic and very real concern for people. They want to make sure the vaccine that goes in their body and their kid's body is safe. That was done, and then we've had chops and changes, and people have said, oh, well, I wouldn't mind waiting for Pfizer, and it's delayed it. I think a lot of people wanted to get the best vaccine, but, shifting advice from chief health officers and ATAGI looking at, minuscule risks in this whole thing meant people said, well, we're under no pressure immediately to do it. I think it would be a mistake, though, for Ben to ramp that up to say this is a general concern around vaccination more generally. There are some anti-vaxxers, no doubt, but they're at the fringe.
I I'll go to you on that as well, Ben, because today we've seen in Brisbane at the Convention Centre, 1,500 spots allowed, available, all booked up straight away. We're seeing younger Australians jump at the chance for the jab, AstraZeneca, obviously in large part because that's where that availability is at. To me, if there is a cohort that's reticent, I reckon there is still a chunk of that group that will get on board when they see the rest of the country getting it, and particularly when we get to a point where you'll need it to get on a plane or to get into some venues, because states will head in that direction. There's no doubt about it.
I think that's the big debate that we're just starting that's going to become a lot more important. We've talked about the incentives. I think there is a role for incentives, but it's the big debate around disincentives and how to make that work. Some workplaces saying that you need to be vaccinated to work there, maybe go to football. In France, we've got those sweeping new laws that have been really controversial. But there's obviously a need for that and take the community with you on that. But there are some problems for the government. I mean, George Christensen using the platform of the parliament to denounce masks, to say that vaccines don't work, I think putting those people down...
but the government did condemn that and reject that.
Good.
So it's one person, an outlier, a fringe dweller, and he was rejected by his own government.
I hope so. But I think there are problems on that side of the government and in other parts of the community about these disincentives, the vaccine passports, because I think that's actually the big debate that we're going to have going forward, how to put in place those disincentives that encourage people to get vaccines.
Well,
I just
if you
think
look at France, look at the
outrageous.
situation in France at the moment, and they're using those vaccine requirements. Will we head in that direction?
Yeah, I liked what Macron had to say. I mean, he's facing election. He basically said it's time for people who haven't had the vaccine to stay at home, rather than those who are going through, lockdowns more generally. I just think it's outrageous to cast aspersions after 18 months of absolute concerted effort by the federal government to look at the comments of one backbencher to besmirch the efforts to get through this pandemic. I mean, it's quite outrageous to suggest that we've had the Prime Minister probably doing nothing else for the last 18 months aside from the absolute core necessary task to get us through the pandemic. If there's any doubt about where the government lies on getting through the pandemic, I want to dispel that. That is priority number one. And I would say that goes across state and territory governments as well, to sort of look at this and say, oh, we've got problems because there's a backbencher that said something about masks is
it's
completely
actually
wrong.
unusual for a government to grant leave to the opposition leader to condemn one of their own members. But that's what happened yesterday after
Exactly, and very, very quickly. So if there is one group, and polling has shown this, it is Greens that have the problem with vaccination, and that goes to a long-standing view among some Greens about anti-vax more generally.
I think you'd be silly to dismiss the disinformation that's out there and those that peddle it.
Totally right. I agree with that fully.
Thing that we have to address, whether it's politicians, whether it's online, because at the moment we're actually doing the easy part of the community. It's the people at the end of it who are reluctant.
But the idea that
disinformation is going to work.
The idea that we are split as a nation in handling this pandemic as quickly and rationally as possible, I think, is completely wrong.
It is good to, as Anthony Albanese did yesterday, call it out where it arises, and the Prime Minister, good for him to agree with that. I certainly endorse the position of both of them, and the way they responded, I think, was entirely appropriately. Let's look at the International Panel on Climate Change, because this report, while the immediate focus is all on the pandemic, understandably for the next few months until we get to that percentage of the population vaccinated, this is looming as a massive challenge for Scott Morrison, both in a national sense, but also in a political sense. He's facing these pressures. Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, this is their big ticket foreign policy and international agenda, both of them, our biggest allies, our most important allies. The pressure will be intense on the Prime Minister to up his ambition. At home, you've got Barnaby Joyce and the Nationals pulling him the other way. How does he navigate that?
I think there's a debate going on within the coalition, there's no doubt about that, and that is to be expected, to be honest, because it is the coalition that holds, 95% of rural and regional seats. So there is a genuine debate about who bears the weight of this. I think from everything I'm hearing, there's great and productive discussions going on within the coalition around this. And I think every sign has been, since Joe Biden has been elected president in the US, that there's been very constructive debate on the road forward to Glasgow, which is early November.
I think the Prime Minister's move yesterday to talk about the markets and investors and where the dollars are going says it all, really, because it is a world that's changing. You can either ignore it...
Totally right.
...or you either accept it and be a part of that, because, as the PM says, there are so many... The money speaks in this space.
Absolutely, and you can see where this is going, and this is the great opportunity because there's a ton of really good things that are going on with technology. We're doing some work with a group called BZE that want to create 1 million jobs out of green technology, and suddenly that's where the sweet spot is. I think it's important to recognise, though, that Australia has met its Kyoto targets and exceeded them. It's met and exceeded its Paris targets, unlike a lot of other OECD countries. And it's also important, I think the focus is starting to come on some of these developing countries that have managed to get through without meeting those same targets that they'd be brought in as developed countries now that they are.
Were you encouraged by some of the language from the Prime Minister in the wake of the IPCC report, the first in 8 years?
I think the big thing for the Prime Minister is he's got the wrong policy settings. This has to be an end for the gas-fired recovery. The United Nations Secretary General has said about the IPCC report, this is a message to get off fossil fuels, end coal. There's no way the Prime Minister can go to Glasgow saying we've got a gas-fired recovery. The Beetaloo Basin, which is being subsidised to the tune of $220 million from the federal government, the anti-fracking inquiry said that would increase Australia's emissions by 8%. That's before you account for the gas when it's burnt overseas, a total of 100 million tonnes extra on government inquiry-owned numbers. So I think the discordant thing is, here's a message that we're listening, yet we're subsidising the very industry that's going to do the damage to the climate that the Secretary-General says we have to get off. And until that policy dilemma is solved, the government's going to be in a whole heap of trouble.
Ben Oquist and David Gazzard, gents, great to see you both.
20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.